Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in San Diego, California, aboard the USS Midway Museum, one of the coolest ships in Navy history. And we're here with Karl Zingheim, who is the staff historian here aboard USS Midway, a distinguished graduate of the United States Naval Academy, class of 1986. Karl, talk to us a little bit about the significance and the importance of the Midway. Incredibly historic ship, pioneered big deck operations, and it's also unique in terms of the museum, the carrier museums that are available in the country. Tell us a little bit about the ship and the mission you guys have here.
Absolutely, Vago. Well, Midway is a unique specimen amongst preserved aircraft carriers that are now museums. She was a transition from the era of unprotected wooden deck carriers that fought World War II, and just before we had the big supercarriers that came out that supported jet aviation from the beginning. So Midway represents this interim change when the propeller aircraft were still the norm at the beginning of her career, and then she had to transition rather quickly to accommodate jet aviation. That's why she got an angle deck added later. She featured an armored deck originally, which was the first for an American carrier, and she was also the first carrier to be home ported permanently in a foreign port. So she spent the last 18 years of her 47-year deploying history out of Yokosuka, Japan. So Midway is really a unique specimen of aircraft carrier to have preserved today for today's public.
And the ship also sports a whole series of features, and I want to talk also about the history of modifications because, we were talking about this. No ship has been more modified, nor will continue to be modified for the next 100 or 200 years and how long she's here. And exquisitely maintained by the guys in Yokosuka, which always had a reputation for taking very good care of ships, the Japanese yard workers who would work on the ship. But tell us a little bit about a series of novel features, because this carrier was designed not for any restriction, but the kind of carrier the Navy thought that it needed for the kind of fleet it thought it would need in the post-war world.
Definitely. What defined the fleet that actually fought World War II were arbitrary tonnage restrictions that were imposed by a well-meaning naval restriction series of treaties starting in the 1920s. What that means is that you're producing compromised designs that have to go out and fight. So the Midway was the very first pass at producing an aircraft carrier after the treaty system had collapsed in the late 1930s. And so basically the drawing board was clean. And so the American Navy always favored having large air groups as part of its carrier doctrine. The problem with having an armored carrier, for example, as opposed to a wooden deck carrier, is that you have to have a trade-off. The British did that because they didn't have control of their own aircraft until just before World War II started, so their armored carriers could only carry about half as many aircraft as an American carrier of the same period would. So with Midway, because there were no arbitrary restrictions and you had the sky-high wartime budgets, the designers could go whole hog and develop a ship large enough to have an armored protective system but still carry a massive American air wing that our doctrine favored. It also meant that passively the ship was also extensively subcompartmentalized, so she was the most thoroughly compartmentalized ship design ever. Every engine has its own room. All 12 boilers each has its own protected space. Triple layer protection, armored decking on the hangar deck as well, side belts. So Midway in many ways was really overbuilt for potential battle later because that's what they wanted to have. Her original hull designation was CVB. As in a large battle carrier. And so they overbuilt her with protective features because even by 1945, when things were not so demanding, the Navy was complaining about how cramped the Midways were.
And the ship also had a huge gunnery department when she was originally, because she was an axial deck carrier as originally intended, armored, but also had a massive gun armament.
She was the first carrier design that the Americans produced that had no flight deck armament. So all the armament was carried on large sponsons on either side of the ship, including a full battery, port and starboard, of the new 5-inch 51 air and surface gun, as well as other automatic anti-aircraft guns. So when you factor in the extensive gun battery and the fire controlment, it turns out that in the first years of the Midway's history, the gunnery department on an aircraft carrier nearly rivaled the air department in size.
Now that is a heck of a trivia question to ask somebody. No ship has also been more extensively modified over the decades, most of it good, some of it not as good, and I want to talk about that, her reputation as the rockinest, rollingest largest carrier in the Navy, in part because of her extensions and overhangs and permanent list. Talk to us a little bit about how the evolution of the ship, what the strong parts are, for example, flight deck acreage, which rivals almost anything we have in the fleet today, but also some of the downsides of that.
Well, a lot of this stems from the fact that she was designed in the 1940s, where they had certain design habits already factored in, and the armored deck. For example, they had to cheat a little bit to keep the metacentric height under control, so the in-between space on the decks is actually several inches lower than you have on other contemporary ship designs. And then when you factor in all the plumbing and the ducting and all that, when you get below decks, if you're really tall, you have to stoop and be that way the entire time you're on the ship. So that turned out to be a negative factor because Midway's hangar deck is actually a full deck lower than the big deck carriers that we have today. She has a similar hangar clearance as a World War II aircraft carrier, even though she was a deploying unit all the way until the early 1990s. She also came about at a time when the fleet desperately had to transition into jet aviation in order to stay viable. That meant incorporating by the mid-1950s a whole series of breakthroughs the British had come up with to make jet aviation viable at sea. And that included, of course, steam catapults, upgraded optical landing systems for coming aboard, and an angled deck. So after she was finished with her world tour, shifting from Atlantic to Pacific Fleet, because she was built too big for the Panama Canal, she had to go the long way around in 1955 to join the Pacific Fleet. She went up to Bremerton for an SCB overhaul and modification. That's where she finally got a fully enclosed hurricane bow and her first angle deck. But time went on, and the Defense Department was trying to incorporate its first pass at a joint with single-use aircraft, the F-111 project. And so in order to keep the Midway and her two sisters viable in this future of having this one large aircraft that would serve the Air Force and the Navy, Midway was brought back in 1966 for what turned out to be an expensive 4-year overhaul at Hunters Point, just south of San Francisco, and she got this current 13 degree, that's the most radical offset degree of any carrier, to help incorporate the large and heavy F-111. Now, the Navy F-111 went nowhere, but the Midway still wound up having this extensive growth in her flight deck. It's just over 4 acres and this 13 degree offset. That also meant that over time, she got a reputation for being a roller. And if you got the C's just right, she would start to impart what was known as a Dutch roll. So imagine trying to land your aircraft on the carrier, and your point of reference, being your optical landing system, is doing its own separate dance. So the neat thing about working with Air Wing 5, being permanently affiliated with the Midway in the last third of her career, is that you got used to it. So it wasn't like we were constantly breaking in a new batch of rookie pilots from a visiting air group. So they got used to it. However, it became enough of a problem that by the mid-1980s, NAVC wanted to find ways to fix these problems. And this is where we have the infamous blistering modification, where the ship was brought into the yards in Japan, and she was basically given a 6-foot extension on her beam on either side with added compartments to make her wider. And then they took her back out for trials. And it turns out they kind of solved some problems and invented entirely new ones.
So what were some of the problems it solved, and what were the new problems it invented?
Well, from what I could tell from the conversations that were being held by people who were in that aboard ship at that time, she went from being a tender roller, where it's a continuous motion, to being stiff, where she would suddenly tip and then correct herself and then knock to the other side. She also always tended to have a list, and so that could be corrected with a turn, but what can you do with that? But the really peculiar problem too as well was that she was so wide for her length she couldn't keep her head. And that's critical when you're trying to steer a course to recover aircraft and in the frequent underway replenishments. So what they wound up doing was taking a giant surfboard skeg and welding it to the very end of the waterline. So at low tide, if you're walking on the pier to this day, you look at the very end of the Midway's waterline, you could see this steel structure that's still attached to the hull. That was to help keep the ship steering in any one given direction because of the problem of a wandering head, because she was now so much wider than she was before.
And a testament to good naval architecture solving problems to this day, even if they look a little Rube Goldberg-like.
Well, it was my understanding that after the fact, it was pointed out that someone in the design phase had made a miscalculation. And then every other assumption on the design had been built in with this fundamental flaw at the beginning. It was also my understanding, too, that Japanese shipwrights had warned them that we don't think this is going to work out the way you think it will, but we're happy to take your money and do the installation anyway.
I had heard that story, actually, that guys involved with it had said, I'm not sure this is really going to work for you guys, but hey, you want us to do it, we'll do it. I want to take you to her distinguished service record. She is of World War II, but didn't properly serve in World War II, but extremely distinguished service throughout the Vietnam War, where friends of mine served aboard her repeatedly on repeated war cruises. And then throughout the Cold War, and then also during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, where she played a key role as part of the Navy contribution to that war. Talk to us about some of her service highlights.
Well, she only missed World War II by 4 weeks. So her construction at Norfolk, by the way, was at a breathtaking pace. It kind of rivals the construction of the Dreadnought in 1904, so which is phenomenal when you're talking about the prototype of an entirely new design, and they were able to burn right through and get her built inside 3 years. So that's remarkable in its own right. But she barely missed World War II, but was on hand for, guess what, the Cold War with early experiments. As early as 1947, she was already experimenting with ways to potentially fight the Soviet Union, such as in the winter 46, cold weather operations in the Labrador Straits. And in 1947, the launching of a V-2 missile from her aft flight deck in a bid to stay competitive with the Air Force, who was trying to monopolize nuclear delivery. And so she was already a Cold War carrier in her tender years and remained a Cold War carrier. After all, she was decommissioned just a year or so after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the Soviet Union. And so as a Cold War carrier, she had 47 years as a deploying unit, which is a record in the 20th century for an aircraft carrier. And she was on hand for numerous crises, especially for the response to the Korean invasion. So she and her two sisters were the only atomic delivery capable carriers, so they stayed with the Sixth Fleet just in case there was another invasion in Europe. She arrived in the Seventh Fleet in 1955, just in time for the Taishan Island crisis off China, and of course was there for the Laotian crisis in Southeast Asia in 1960 that preceded Vietnam, and made her first combat deployment when she was actually 20 years old in 1965. And it just happens to be a matter of happenstance that Midway fighters were able to down the very first and the very last MiGs of the entirety of the Vietnam War, and you'll see that on the scoreboard behind me here on the island. And so she had a dynamic combat deployment in 1965, was pulled offline for 4 years for a super expensive rebuild, came out as practically an entirely new carrier in 1970, and had to make an early accelerated deployment ahead of schedule in response to the 72 invasion of South Vietnam, where she was involved in almost a year's worth of intense air activity against North Vietnam all the way to the end of the war. So she had an extraordinarily busy service, even though her amount of on-station time, like compared to, say, the Constellation or other carriers, wasn't as great. She still had very much a lot of combat in her for her air groups. Then she was transitioned to Japan to help take the pressure off the rest of the carriers, and so in 1973 she arrived in Yokosuka, which would be her home for the next 18 years. And so what that meant was that as minute she cleared the outer buoy, she was practically on station, and it was a place where you had the Russian overflights, you had North Korean vessels, you had all kinds of things with Chinese and other vessels. It was a very busy time, even though it was technically peacetime, that the Midway was literally, as they say, the tip of the sword for America for the balance of the Cold War in Far Eastern and Indian Ocean waters. Then we fast forward, let me go back to 1975. So she's just settling into Japan when word gets out that things are really going sour in South Vietnam. They'd already had Operation Eagle Pole to get personnel out of Cambodia, and they needed to have a similar function for South Vietnam. So Midway offloaded most of her aircraft, took aboard an entire flight of special Air Force large helicopters for personnel transfer, and sped off to operate off South Vietnam. And April 29th and 30th, we have the fame of all that evacuation going on, not only bringing aboard people with the Air Force helicopters, but refugee aircraft from the South Vietnamese Air Force. Helicopters are packed to the bursting limit with people desperate to get out, and they're accommodating these. But the most dramatic event of all that drama occurred on the 30th of April when an O-2 Bird Dog light plane flew out from an island off Saigon looking for a place to land. It was piloted by a Vietnamese major who had his wife and 5 kids stuffed inside. And he had no place else to go. He couldn't ditch. And so the captain reluctantly decided there's no other way to save them. Clear the flight deck. They pushed the other aircraft aside, turned her into wind, and the pilot was able to make a perfect 3-point landing on her deck. His first ever carrier landing saved his entire family. And then, of course, the drama doesn't end there, because after everyone else had been airlifted off the Midway, there was a threat that all the other aircraft that fled west to Thailand were going to be promptly handed back over to the communists. And so Midway went into the Gulf of Thailand right on the heels of the frequent wind operation and had barged over all those refugee Vietnamese jets and helicopters that went in the other direction. And she carried those back to Guam. And on the way, she ran into the very first of the boat people phenomenon and saved a whole slew of people on a sinking craft just off Thailand. So Midway was always in the midst of that. And then you fast forward to 1990 with the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and Midway eventually became the flagship of the eastern half of the naval air effort going on during the Desert Storm campaign.
And this is all with an aircraft carrier that had 2 bow catapults, right? Her original installation is what she had, and 3 elevators, right? And you used to have a centerline elevator, but now you moved it to deck edge, and was still very much of a frontline ship.
Definitely. Well, she was the flagship as well. One advantage that Midway had was that she was permanently married to Air Wing 5, unlike other carriers that basically embark their Air Wing for particular deployment and then they go back ashore and go their separate ways. The Midway's Air Department and Air Wing 5 could know how each other thinks. They've been operating together so long and so routinely with the limited facilities, flight deck facilities the ship had to offer, that they could maintain the same cyclic rates as the larger deck carriers had with more catapults and more elevators, because they knew each other and they worked all the time. Another interesting little factoid too, of all the air wings that had fought off carriers in Desert Storm, Midway's was the only one that didn't have a single combat casualty.
So now talk to us about why she was retired from service, because she'd had that big period of work in the 80s. She'd had another yard availability shortly before the war, where folks had an expectation that she was going to serve for, as a fan of the Midway, was going to serve for considerably more years. Talk to us about why she was retired.
Well, at the time a lot of these decisions were made, the Cold War looked like it was just going to carry on for the rest of the century. So Midway was performing valuable work operating out of Yokosuka, and there was no reason not to suppose that she had at least another decade or so service in her. And so they invested in improving her seakeeping abilities for these last several years of service as a deploying carrier, and transitioning to the F-18, which she did successfully in 1986. Well, geopolitics changed much more rapidly than naval planning did, and so by the beginning of the 1990s, you didn't have an organized Soviet Union as a coherent threat anymore, and China was still coming out of the shadow of Maoism at that time, and we basically had a lot of shifting balances going on in that transitional phase at the beginning of the 1990s decade. And so right after Desert Storm was concluded and facing drastic defense cutbacks at that time, it was decided, you know what, we can just deploy another one of our carriers to Japan and we can finally bring Midway home and retire her. She performed well, but we need to make cuts somewhere, and so Midway was brought back. The independence relieved her, and so in April of 1992, over at North Island, right across the channel from where we are now, she had her final decommissioning ceremony. And then she was towed straight up to Bremerton and put into the inactive ships maintenance section up there for a number of years. And so it was literally planning for one type of a contingency and then having the world hand you something completely different just a few years later.
But when that happened, like a lot of old carriers, I worked for many years aboard the Intrepid Museum when she was brand new, and the Navy recycles these ships very quickly, starts to pull off any equipment that could go back to the fleet and be used. And you guys certainly saw that in a lot of places that you wanted to turn into exhibit spaces eventually. Talk to us about the bringing the ship back to life, the amount of work you guys have had to do on that front, and the challenges associated with it. Again, I mean, I worked on the Intrepid from 82 to about 85. Just the sheer amount of work. That was a wood flight deck ship. This one was an armored ship, but still enormous amount of maintenance required. Talk to us about the bringing back to life piece of it, and then the continued work required to keep a ship like this people ready and looking in tip-top shape as she does now.
Well, as you mentioned, Vago, she was struck off the register, which means that she's not even considered for reactivation in 1994, just 2 years after her decommissioning. So this was a ship, as far as anyone knew, had no future. Well, it's funny, about the same time all this was going on, there was a genesis of an idea down in San Diego to bring a retired carrier to San Diego as a museum. And originally we were supposed to get Ranger. But eventually Midway was settled upon. And so when we finally did get possession of Midway in August of 2003, we found it was a mixed bag. The decommissioning process, the demilling process, had been very rigorously applied across the ship, and a lot of systems had been removed. All the radar antennas and communications facilities had been removed. So a lot of the more sophisticated or technical spaces had to be built back up from scratch. And of course, aircraft had to be acquired all over again. But the neat thing is that because she was a deploying ship all the way to the very edge and had only been in a mothballed condition for just a few years, we essentially wound up structurally with an almost new ship, which helped us in many ways, particularly in making sure we got a good start on continuous hull preservation, which we do to this day. So it was kind of a good news, bad news, where the good news is she's a solid ship, she's exceptionally well preserved structurally, and the not so good news is, well, a lot of the fun technical doohickeys on board just aren't there anymore, and we have to start all over again to acquire them. But that gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a mission. And the neat thing about that is it allowed us to bring in more people into the Midway family, people who were specialists, people who knew how to acquire certain pieces of equipment, people who had know-how, and to bring them all together to contribute their artisan talents into reinvigorating the ship and bringing her back to a certain degree of where she was when she was still active.
And one of the things that you guys have done is... Let me ask another question. They're going to ask you two. These are my last two questions because otherwise, literally the sun will be going down and we'll still be standing here. Why? We talked about this a little bit before. That this is actually the perfect ship in the perfect place because San Diego is a Navy town to its core, and that the relationship that you guys have with the town is very different from what Yorktown has in South Carolina. Intrepid, to a larger degree, is a major tourist hub, so it benefits from that. But the other two Estes-class ships are little not quite as central as you guys are here, with the Navy tradition that's here, the expertise that's here, and how that plays into then the events that keeps you in with the financial resources to do what you got to do.
I really see this as just an extension of the fact that if it weren't for the Navy, San Diego wouldn't even be a city. This goes all the way back to 1908 and diverting the Great White Fleet to see what San Diego had to offer, because they were just supposed to go straight to San Francisco. And the fact that as geopolitics changed after World War I and the fleet came to the West Coast in World War II, the Navy made San Diego happen, because we're completely cut off from the rest of the continent with our backcountry here. We're just a harbor with nowhere to go. But thankfully, the Navy got to see what San Diego had to offer. The neat thing about that is, of course, is that it works both ways. And so we have a population here that is unique in its support of the sea services that you probably don't see to the same degree in other communities, because It's largely a town that it was a cooperative build between city leaders and the Navy Department over the course of the 20th century. And so what does that mean for the Midway? Well, we're very much a part of the scenery here, even though we've only been here since 2004. We're an educational facility now. We're a fantastic special events venue, but it really showed in its most visceral way when we had an anniversary showing of the Top Gun movie. And we had all kinds of San Diegans, not just people from around the world, San Diegans standing in line for hours on the pier with their gear to go watch this 30-year-old movie on our flight deck here and come off having a wonderful time. So it just goes to show you that this is a special town, and I can't think of a better thing to add to our community than to have an aircraft carrier that our community can enjoy.
And also give you, I mean, just behind us is a commissioning ceremony. There are retirement ceremonies that happen here. Professional, there was a basketball game that happened here on the flight deck. Hey, real estate helps, right? You have ample space. So I have to ask you this question. This ship was complete. Each one of the Midway ships, class ships, the Coral Sea and the Franklin Roosevelt, were completely different in how they were. Talk to us about sort of the differences among the ships. FDR went out a long time ago. Coral Sea lasted a little bit longer until the early 80s, into the 80s when she was replaced, and then Midway into 92. Talk to us about the differences in each of these ships and why the development of some of them were stunted and the Midways just kept going.
Well, there were actually supposed to be 6 Midways. When the Navy was building its Uber fleet designs, they really wanted to pack it with new designs, and President Roosevelt said, no, you guys are gold plating. And so he personally canceled 3 of the projected Midway class carriers. And so the Navy starts off with the 3. 2 of them were built in a private yard, and the Franklin Roosevelt was built at the New York Navy Yard. And so they had remarkably similar careers in the early portion of their lifespans. And so where you start to see some differentiation is when the modifications that were necessary to make carriers viable in the jet age start to take effect. And so all 3 carriers, of course, get an initial angle deck in the 1950s, just like the Essex class did. And so they soldiered on with that. It was just that Midway was the first one brought offline to get extensive modifications for adapting the F-111 and other things for another generation of angle deck carriers. The other 2 sisters were supposed to go through that very same rebuild. But because the constructions and other delays took so long at Hunters Point and cost an astonishing $400 million in those years' dollars, the Navy says, we can't afford to do this anymore. And so the other 2 carriers only received more refined refits after that. Well, the neat thing is that it didn't really matter. Those other 2 carriers went on to have useful careers for as long as they lasted. Now, you mentioned about the Franklin Roosevelt leaving service first. She left in 1977, 79, thereabouts. That was largely, as I understand it, a deal with the Carter administration to allow funding to construct another Nimitz class. And so the trade-off was, fine, you can have your new Nimitz class, but you're going to have to retire somebody. And so the Roosevelt was selected. All the other Essexes by this time had already been retired, and the Roosevelt...
With the exception of Lex, which stayed till 1990.
Not as a deploying carrier.
Okay, that's true, as an AVT, all right, correct. She was the training carrier.
She was an auxiliary at that point. Right. But there were all the other Essexes, the CVSs were gone, and the CDA versions were gone. So where were you going to make that cut? And so it turned out to be the Franklin Roosevelt. She had some engineering issues that were going on as well, so it made sense at that point. If you had to cut somebody, it turned out to be the Franklin Roosevelt. But the gain in that was we got another Nimitz-class carrier approved by the reluctant Carter administration at that time. Now, we go over to the Coral Sea. Coral Sea, of course, has a fantastic history with Vietnam. Extensive combat deployments, no modifications like Midway had to go through. And she's still a viable carrier in the Pacific, and later, towards the end of her career, shifting over to the Atlantic in the 1980s. And so it gets to show you how fine the design was originally for the Midway design, and, of course, the quality of craftsmanship that you get from Newport News Shipbuilding.
Yeah, I mean, extraordinary. And the engine room, just for people to know, is a kind of a geeky moment, but the engine room layout is really different on this ship than it is for anybody else, because if you historically look at it, you have fire room, engine room. On the Essex class, it was two boilers in each fire room, engine room, engine room, whereas aboard this ship, the boilers are on the periphery of the engine rooms.
Well, not only do you have that kind of arrangement, but they're all in their own little separate armored compartments. And so you've got 12 boilers on this ship and 12 fire rooms. And each engine has its own separate space. And not only that, you don't have any lateral communication below the third deck as well. And so you have hyper compartmentalization on there, which, by the way, they did not repeat with the Forstall class and beyond.
Yes, because that enforces weight and complexity.
It did, and it also had a serious impact on habitability, just like the fact that the tween deck spaces to compensate for the original armored deck meant that, yeah, you had a more cramped and confined space. And even in 1945, they were complaining.
But tell us about the namesake of the ship in the Battle of Midway and how critically important that, there are hinge points in history, and that is a true hinge point that was really 15 minutes start to finish, if you really think about it from a timing standpoint. Tell us about the Battle of Midway, because you guys are named for the ship, and we've also had a great anniversary of that important battle.
Well, the old Navy naming conventions back then was that aircraft carriers were named for either ships of the classic sailing Navy or famous American battles. And so Midway, of course, was an important battle, and it was a carrier battle, so it made sense to name an entirely new class of carriers after this pivotal battle. What's really interesting about Midway as well as an action is it's one of the few decisive and relevant battles where the decisions of junior personnel could turn the entire thing. And we see this with the choice of John Waldron defying orders from superiors to go on his own course to find the Japanese fleet. And tragically, he was proven correct. Or in having Wade McCluskey deciding to stick it out some more. The Japanese have got to be out here somewhere, and finally coming across that stray Japanese destroyer trying to catch back up. Or even in the midst of a dive, when unfortunately McCluskey, who's a fighter pilot, mistakenly ordered everybody, 2 full squadrons, to follow him on the one target, Dick Best, who was a genuine dive bomber squadron commander, said, well, wait a minute, we're over-concentrating here. And so he broke off his dive in the midst of combat, brought in his 2 wingmen, and improvised an attack on the neighboring Akagi, and was able to get devastating hits on there. Critical decisions made by junior personnel. Jimmy Thatch, who demonstrated his new revolutionary thatch weave tactic to defeat the Zero, was demonstrated at Midway. So that's another neat thing about Midway, in addition to the code breaking and the valor, is the fact that it's one of the few major battles in history where on-the-spot decisions by junior personnel actually made a difference. And so the Midway, of course, is proud to carry on that legacy. We are the venue, of course, for the Navy's annual observations of the Battle of Midway night on the West Coast. And we also have a dedicated holographic theater and exhibit to the battle for which the ship is named.
Karl, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. It's a real pleasure, especially to talk to somebody with this much passion about such an important topic, and wish you all the great success. Thanks very much, Karl. Appreciate it.